At our 35th anniversary dinner, in front of 16 people, including my brother, my son, our family pastor, and people who had known the two of us since the Clinton administration, my wife called me freight. That's the word she used. Freight, something sitting in the back of a truck, taking up space, not doing a thing. I laughed. I made a joke back so nobody at that table would feel uncomfortable. Not one person there knew that 4 hours later, my life would go a completely different direction. My phone rang, and a woman I had never spoken to in my life started reading me the final terms on the sale of the company I spent 30 years building. And here's the worst part. Nobody had told me it was happening. My name is Milo Thibodeau. Everybody's called me Milo since I was about 9 years old. I'm 68, and I live in Portland, Maine, up on the Deering side, in a house I finished paying off in 2016. For 30 years I've run Thibodeau Architectural Metals, copper, sheet metal, standing seam roofs, gutters and conductor heads, cupolas, flashing, steeple work. If you've driven up Route 1 and looked at a church and thought that's a handsome old building, there's a real chance somebody in my shop made the thing on top of it, and there's a decent chance it was me. I started that company in 1996 out of a one-bay garage on Presumpscot Street with a brake, a set of hand seamers, and a Ford F-250 I bought for $2,600 off a guy in Westbrook who wanted cash. First real job I ever landed was a copper porch roof in Cape Elizabeth. Took me 9 days. I stood on that roof in August and hand-seamed the whole thing because I didn't own a machine that could do it, and I lost 11 pounds that week. By 2012, we had 8,000 square feet on Warren Avenue, 38 employees, a waiting list running about 9 months out, contracts with restoration outfits from here down to Newport. I built that with my hands and my back, and my wife's name went on the incorporation papers right next to mine in 1996, because in 1996 Roz and I did everything together. Rosalind Thibodeau, 65 years old. We got married in September of 1990 at a church in Yarmouth, and for a very long stretch of my life, I'd have told you it was the smartest thing I ever did. We raised 2 kids in that house. Our son Beckett Beck is 34 and carries the title of Director of Business Development. I'm going to be honest with you about what that job actually involved, because it matters. It involved a business card, a company phone, and about 6 real phone calls a week. I made that title up for him in 2018. Remember that. It comes back and it's on me. Our daughter Noelle is 30. She's a veterinary technician at a clinic out in Brunswick. She makes about $41,000 a year, she has $11,000 left in student loans, and she calls me every Thursday evening. Not to ask for anything, just to ask how I'm doing. 30 years old and she's never asked me for $1 in her life. Hold on to that. That one matters most of all. In March of this past year, on a Tuesday morning, I was standing at the brake in the shop, and the left side of my mouth stopped working. Ischemic stroke. 5 days at Maine Med, and 8 weeks of occupational therapy learning to do things I'd been doing since I was 19. My speech came back completely. My mind's fine. I'll put my head against anybody's. But my left hand doesn't do fine work anymore. Not reliably. It's about 80%, which sounds like a lot until you understand that seaming copper is a two-handed job measured in 30 seconds of an inch. And my balance is off just enough that I don't trust myself on staging anymore. I want you to understand what that second one took from me, because it's not obvious. I have been going up on roofs since 1979, steeples mostly in the last 20 years. 60 feet up on a plank with the whole town laid out under you, and a piece of copper you cut yourself going down exactly where it belongs. That's the part I loved. Not the business, not the contracts, being up there. And in March, that ended. In one Tuesday morning, at a break, at 68 years old. So I handed more of the floor to my shop foreman, a woman named Tova Lindgren who's been with me 17 years, and who I'd trust with the keys to anything I own. What I didn't know, and this is the part that took me months to see, is that a stroke doesn't just take things from you. It hands certain people a calendar. The anniversary dinner was the second Saturday in October, 35 years to the week. Roz wanted to do it properly, and I want to be fair to her. I was glad she did. 16 people. Our neighbors, the Ouellets. Pastor Jim and his wife from the church out in Falmouth, where we'd gone for 18 years. My brother Renee drove down from Presque Isle. Beck and his fiancée Danica. Noelle came by herself. And our chief financial officer, Dermot Keane, and his wife Simone. I hired Dermot 12 years ago, and I let that man see every single number that mattered in my life. Roz made a crown roast. Put out the good dishes, the ones that come out twice a year, candles, cloth napkins, the whole production, and she's good at it. She has always been good at it. The first hour was exactly what an anniversary dinner ought to be. Pastor Jim made a toast about endurance. Renee told a story about my wedding day involving a rented tuxedo and a flat tire that I have heard 400 times and still laughed at. I sat at the head of that table with my wife of 35 years on my right, and for about an hour I let myself believe that March hadn't changed one single thing. Then Simone Keene asked how the transition was going. Perfectly innocent question. Most of that table knew about the stroke. A few of them knew I'd been off the floor. And Roz set her wine glass down and smiled the way she smiles at church, which is warm on top and rehearsed underneath, and I'd never once let myself notice that until that night. "Oh, it's going," she said. "Milo's been a real trooper. We've had to rearrange an awful lot, though. He just can't carry what he used to carry." I nodded, a little uncomfortable, not alarmed. People talk about your health at dinner parties. I even said something about how there was plenty left in me yet. And that's when my wife laughed, small laugh, and turned to Simone and said the sentence. "Some days he's just freight, honestly, but we love him for it." Freight. Now I want to slow this way down, because it took about 9 seconds, and I have been over those 9 seconds more than any other 9 seconds of my life. The table went quiet, and not the polite little pause after a joke that didn't quite land. A real one. The kind where you can hear the ice move in somebody's glass. Pastor Jim's fork stopped about 4 inches off his plate and stayed there. My brother Renee's face changed so fast, I actually watched it happen. I saw the whole thing cross him, confusion into understanding into something close to anger, in maybe a second and a half. Danica looked at Beck. Beck looked at his plate, and my daughter Noelle put her napkin down on the table. Slow, deliberate, squared up next to her fork. That's what you do with your hands when they need a job so they'll stop shaking. And I looked at my wife of 35 years, the woman whose name is on the papers, who I raised 2 kids with, who sat with me in a hospital in Lewiston the week my mother died, and she wasn't even looking at me. She was reaching across for the serving spoon, putting more roast on Simone's plate, completely untroubled, like she'd made a remark about the weather. And here's what I did, and people ask me about this constantly, so let me just say it. I laughed. Out loud, an easy, comfortable sound. And I said something like, "Well, somebody's got to be the load, might as well be me for once." And that table relaxed. Immediately, Pastor Jim laughed with relief. Renee reached over and squeezed my forearm. Somebody asked about the potatoes. And my wife smiled at me, satisfied, like I'd played my part correctly. And underneath that tablecloth, where not one person in that room could see it, my left hand was going. And it wasn't the stroke. I want to talk to you directly for a second, because I think this is the most useful thing I've got. I didn't laugh, because I'm a good man. I laughed because I have spent my whole life being the one who keeps a room comfortable. And when that sentence landed, my body did what it always does before my brain gets a vote. If you have ever rescued the person who just cut you, smoothed it over, made the joke, kept the table easy, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and you know it isn't kindness. It's a habit. And habits are what people build plans around. I didn't say another word about it. I cleared plates. I hugged Pastor Jim at the door. I thanked my brother for the drive. And when the last car went down the driveway, I told Roz I was tired, kissed the side of her head, and went up and lay in the dark with my eyes open, running that sentence on a loop. Some days he's just freight. At 10:52 that night, my phone lit up on the nightstand. Roz was beside me, asleep or doing a good impression of it. Number I didn't know. I nearly let it go. Something made me answer. "Mr. Thibodeau?" A woman's voice. Professional, slightly hurried, the way people sound at the end of a long Saturday. "My name is Imogen Rask. I'm an associate at Larkin & Boyd. I'm calling regarding the consent signature we still need for Monday morning's closing." I sat up, slow, got my feet on the floor without making the bed creak, and I walked out into the hallway before I said one word. "I'm sorry," I said. "Closing on what?" And there was a pause on that line that I will hear for the rest of my life. You could practically feel her stomach drop through the phone. "Mr. Thibodeau." Her voice changed completely. Careful now, very careful. I think I may have a wrong understanding of where things stand. I was told you'd been fully briefed on the sale terms. I stood in my own upstairs hallway in the dark with my bare feet on the floorboards I laid myself in 2004. And I said, Miss Rask, I don't know anything about a closing on Monday. What sale? If you're new here, subscribe before we go on, because everything past this point is where my life came apart and then got put back together, and you're going to want to see how. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I like knowing who's up with me. Imogen Rask did not hang up on me. I want to give that woman credit for the rest of my life. A less careful attorney would have panicked, apologized, and ended that call in 8 seconds to protect herself. She didn't. She sat there in the silence and worked out exactly what she had walked into. And then she asked me one question. Mr. Thibodeau, are you currently a listed member of Thibodeau Architectural Metals, LLC? I told her yes. 65% to my name, 35% to my wife's, unchanged since 1996. Another long pause. Then, I think you and I need to have a conversation that doesn't happen on the phone. And Mr. Thibodeau, I'd strongly recommend you have your own attorney with you. I did not sleep that night. I lay next to my wife of 35 years and listened to her breathe, and I went back through every week since March looking for the thing I'd missed. Monday morning I told Roz I had an early meeting with a supplier in Saco, which wasn't entirely a lie, because I did drive somewhere, just not to Saco. I drove to a small office on Free Street belonging to a man named Whit Corrigan. He'd handled a lease dispute for me back in 2009. No glass lobby, no receptionist. A desk, 2 chairs, and a man who looks you in the face when he shakes your hand. I told him all of it. The dinner, the word freight, the 10:52 phone call. He listened the whole way through without interrupting once. And when I finished, he said, Milo, I need you to let me assume the worst is true, and then let's find out together how much of it is. He made 2 calls before I got out of that office. One to Larkin and Boyd requesting formal copies of anything circulated. The other to an investigator he'd used for years, a fellow named Sal Petrosino out of Westbrook. And then Whit looked at me over the top of his glasses and said the thing that reorganized how I thought about the last year. When something this size is happening, it never starts the week before. It starts months out, and people who've had months get comfortable. Comfortable people leave a trail. So I want you to go home and think hard about anything that felt slightly off since last winter, no matter how small. And I did think. And I came up with one thing. Back in June, Tova Lindgren and I had been standing in the finish room, and she mentioned almost in passing that Dermot Keane had been asking her about equipment. Not budget questions. Liquidation questions. What would the brake and the roll former and the plasma table actually bring at auction if the shop ever had to move fast? And I laughed it off. I told her Dermot was probably doing insurance schedules. And Tova did not laugh. She looked at me and said, Milo, I've known that man 12 years. Nobody asks auction values for insurance. I told Whit about that conversation. He wrote it down and didn't say anything, but something moved behind his face. 9 days later, Sal Petrosino came into Whit's office with a folder about 1.5 inches thick and laid it out for me plain, in the voice of a man who has done this 100 times and still doesn't enjoy it. Mr. Thibodeau, your wife's first consultation with Larkin and Boyd is logged March 28th. I did the arithmetic before he finished. 11 days. 11 days after I was admitted. I was still in occupational therapy. I could not reliably button a shirt. And my wife was sitting in a divorce attorney's office in downtown Portland. And there was a great deal more. Dermot Keane had been quietly working a private equity outfit out of Boston called Norwood Bridge Partners for the better part of 11 months. The structure was simple, and it was cold. Raw's files. She cites my post-stroke condition and argues that joint ownership has become unworkable given my diminished capacity, and she pushes for a court-supervised sale of the whole company. Norwood Bridge had put $2.6 million on the table. Our own appraisal from 18 months earlier contracts, client list, equipment, and the building on Warren Avenue came in at 4.8. Dermot stood to take a consulting retainer from Norwood after close, plus a finder's fee Sal put at just over $205,000. And I would end up with either a minority position in a company run by strangers from Boston, or a lump sum engineered to land low, because the legal filing describing my capacity would have been written by my own wife's attorney. I sat in that office a long time and didn't say anything. And then Whit said quietly, "There's one more piece, Milo. I'd rather you heard it from me." Sal slid a single sheet across the desk. A message thread. 14 months of it. I'm not going to read you any of it. Some things a man keeps even when he's telling everything else. But I'll tell you the timestamp on the first one that made it unmistakable. Not ambiguous, not careless, unmistakable. It was 12. 7 inches the morning, the night of our shop's 25th anniversary open house. I'd left that party at 9. I left early because 2 fingers on my left hand had gone numb and stayed numb for about 40 minutes, and I didn't tell one single person because I have never in my life told anybody when something was wrong with me. 4 months later, I had a stroke at a brake press. My wife stayed at that party. So did Dermot. People ask me if I cried. I didn't. I want to be honest about that because I think men lie about this in both directions. What I felt in Whit Corrigan's office was not a hot, sharp thing. It was slow and cold, and it was mostly recognition. Like standing under a roof I'd installed and seeing the stain on the ceiling and knowing, before I ever got up there, exactly which seam had opened. That's the second useful thing I've got for you. Betrayal at that scale almost never surprises you. It just finally gives you permission to stop arguing with yourself about what you already knew. Whit asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I needed a few days. And I told him there was one thing I had to know first. I needed to know about my kids. Noelle called me that Thursday, the way she does, asked how my hand was, asked whether I'd been getting down to the shop, and something in her voice, just steady, just genuinely wanting the answer, made me tell her some of it. She went quiet for a long moment, and then my daughter said, "Dad, tell me all of it, right now, because I'm not going to sit here pretending I haven't known something was wrong with Mom since the summer." Turns out Noelle had been keeping her own list. Her mother canceling their Sunday calls, taking calls out in the garage with the door pulled down, and a strange thing Roz said in August about how a vet tech's salary wasn't much to build a life on, and then, out of nowhere, a comment about how you have to plan for yourself because you never know what happens to a family. Noelle hadn't understood that in August. She understood it in October. Beck was a different conversation, and I need to walk you through it properly. I called my son 2 days after Sal's folder, and I asked him straight out whether he'd known his mother had seen attorneys in March. There was a pause I didn't like. And then Beck said, in the careful voice I have known since he was 17 years old, "Dad, look, Mom's protecting herself. Given your health, nobody knows what's coming. It's probably smart for everybody to have things clear instead of just assuming." So I asked him a second question. Had he seen the Norwood Bridge offer? Longer pause. And then he said, "I've seen the numbers, and honestly, given the market and given that you're not really running things day to day anymore, I don't think it's a bad deal. I think you should look at it." And I sat there in my truck outside a hardware store on Forest Avenue with the engine running, and I asked him one more thing, and I asked it gently, because I wasn't trying to trap him. I said, "Beck, did anybody offer you anything to stay out of the way?" And my son said, "Dad, that's not fair. That's not a no. I want you to sit in that with me, because I sat in it for 40 minutes in that parking lot before I could make myself drive. That's not a no. If you have ever asked somebody you love a direct question and gotten an objection instead of an answer, you already know that the objection is the answer. You just have to be willing to hear it." Over the next 2 weeks, Whit and Sal built the rest of it, and I'll admit I found watching them work strangely comforting. The way watching any craftsman work is comforting, even when it's your own marriage on the bench. Sal confirmed. Roz's 35% had been quietly pledged as collateral on a private note through an entity connected to Norwood structured, so that if the sale collapsed, she was insulated and I was not. Whit confirmed Dermot had submitted 3 separate equipment appraisals to our insurance carrier over 8 months, every one of them low, which would make a $2.6 million sale look defensible on paper. That last one isn't just sharp practice. That's fraud against a carrier. And then Sal, working an entirely different angle, found the thing nobody was looking for. For 26 months, Dermot Keene had been running money out of our vendor accounts through inflated invoices from an outfit called Kennebec Fastener Supply. Sal pulled the state filings. Kennebec Fastener Supply is registered to Dermot's sister-in-law. The business address is a mailbox rental on Forest Avenue about 1.5 miles from my shop. $114,000 over 26 months. I want to tell you the money hurt, and it did. $114,000 is not nothing to a man who started with a used truck and a set of hand seamers. But that wasn't what kept me up. What kept me up was picturing my wife in a conference room downtown on the 28th of March, 11 days in, deciding what my condition was worth in a settlement while I was still working on buttons. There was one good thing in those 2 weeks, and I want to give it to you now, because you deserve to know that not everybody in my life turned into somebody I didn't recognize. I went out to the shop on a Thursday afternoon and found Tova Lindgren in the finish room, hand-seaming the last 18 inches of a conductor head, which she always does by hand no matter what the machines already did. I told her some of it, not all of it. She set down her mallet, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at me for a long moment. Then she went to a locked cabinet by her bench and came back with a notebook, the old kind, with a rubber band around it. I told you about the equipment questions in June, she said. I didn't tell you the rest because I wasn't sure, and I wasn't going to say something about a man I couldn't back up. Inside that notebook, in her handwriting, going back to the previous November, every date Dermot came onto the floor asking something that didn't fit. Every Kennebec delivery that came in priced above what she knew the material cost, because she has been ordering the same fasteners for 17 years, and she knows what a box of anything ought to run. I keep my own records, she said. 17 years, Milo. I wasn't going to let somebody walk this place out from under you and have nothing written down. I stood in that finish room looking at a woman with 17 years in a company that isn't hers, who could have stayed quiet and safe the way my own son did, and instead had been keeping a private ledger of the truth on her own time, because she thought it would matter someday. I told her I wasn't going to forget it. She said, I know, and picked her mallet back up. By the end of those 2 weeks, Whit had everything. He laid it across his desk on a Tuesday and said, Milo, you've got 3 separate problems stacked here, and every single one of them runs in your favor. Documented infidelity. A spouse who consulted counsel 11 days after a medical event, which any judge in this state is going to find uncomfortably quick. And a chief financial officer committing insurance fraud and vendor fraud against a company where your wife is a 35% member with signature authority on the exact accounts he was working. I asked him what he'd do, and Whit Corrigan leaned back and said the thing I've quoted to about a dozen people since. You can take this apart loud, or you can take it apart quiet. Loud feels good for about a day. Quiet holds up for the rest of your life. I took it apart quiet. Quiet meant Whit filed a formal objection to the pending sale, along with the insurance documentation which under our own operating agreement gave me, as majority member, the immediate right to freeze company accounts, pending an internal audit. Neither of them had accounted for that. It's 4 paragraphs on page 9 of a document Dermot himself helped draft in 2013. That killed the Monday closing. The exact closing Imogen Rask had called me about by mistake. Sal's vendor documentation went through Whit to the Cumberland County District Attorney's Office with a formal referral, because $114,000 through a shell supplier is not a civil disagreement. It's a crime, and I wanted it treated like one. Not to be cruel, to make it real. And then I did one thing Whit hadn't suggested. I called Tova Lindgren and asked her to come by the house. I sat her at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd been called freight 5 weeks earlier, and I told her I wanted to restructure the ownership. 18%. Outright. No note, no buy-in, no conditions, effective the day this was over. She didn't say anything for close to a minute. Then she said, Milo, I didn't do any of that for a piece of the company. And I said, I know you didn't. That's the entire reason I'm offering it. Now here's the part everything was walking toward. I asked Roz to sit down with me on the first Sunday in December. Told her I wanted to talk about where things stood, calmly, before either of us said anything in front of a judge. I asked her to have Dermot and Simone over as well. Told her I wanted to settle some business questions before they got expensive, and as far as she knew, Dermot still had no idea anything had been found. I asked Beck to come, framed as a chance to talk honestly as a family. And I asked Noelle to come, and to bring nothing but herself. They all walked into my dining room that evening, believing they were coming to a negotiation. Now I want to slow this all the way down, because it took about 50 minutes, and it is the longest 50 minutes I have ever been inside of. Roz had the same composed face she'd worn in October. She'd put coffee out. She'd set the table with the everyday dishes, which I noticed, and which told me she thought this was procedural. Dermot shook my hand at the door with the easy grip of a man who thinks he's holding the better cards. He asked about my hand. He actually asked about my hand. Simone brought a bottle of wine, and she had no idea. I want to be clear about that, because she's the only person in this story who did nothing to anybody. Beck sat down at the same table where he used to do his homework under my elbow, with the careful, braced expression of a man who thinks he knows the terms. Noelle sat next to me, didn't say a word, put her hand flat on the table where I could see it. I let everybody settle. I poured coffee. And then Whit Corrigan, who had been waiting in my den since 4 o'clock, walked into that dining room with a single folder and sat down at the far end of the table. And I watched my wife's face come apart in stages. Not all at once. That's the thing nobody tells you. It cracked the way a windshield cracks one small place first, and then the lines run. Her hand went to the base of her throat. She looked at Dermot. Dermot looked at Whit, and then, very quickly, at the folder, and I watched a 12-year employee of mine do arithmetic in about 2 seconds. I kept my voice completely level. I want that on the record, because people ask me every time. I said, Roz. 11 days. She didn't say anything. That's how long it was between me waking up at Maine Med and you sitting down at Larkin and Boyd. 11 days. I was still doing buttons. And then I said, Dermot. 11 months. That's how long you were talking to Boston about selling a company you don't own a share of, while working out what you'd personally take home. Simone Keene set her wine glass down on my tablecloth very carefully. She said, Dermot, what is he talking about? And her husband did not answer her, because Whit had already opened the folder. And this is where it stopped being a conversation. Whit laid it out 1 page at a time. Slow. Not dramatic, that's what made it unbearable. He laid those documents down the way you'd deal cards to somebody who's already lost. The message thread, dated, time-stamped, 14 months of it, and he put the first page face up. The 3 insurance appraisals, side by side with the real values out of Tova's notebook, with her handwriting photocopied right there in the margin. The Kennebec Fastener Supply filings. The sister-in-law's name, the mailbox address on Forest Avenue. And last, the referral letter to the district attorney's office. Filed, stamped, dated 6 days earlier. Nobody in that room moved. I could hear the refrigerator in the kitchen. Roz's hands were shaking by the time Whit stopped. She said, Milo, please. We can talk about this. And I want to tell you exactly what I said to my wife of 35 years, because I only got 1 shot at it and I'd been writing it in my head for 6 weeks. I said, I'm not angry that you want it out. People come apart. I understand that better than you think I do, and I've understood it longer than you'd believe. I said, I'm not even standing here about Dermot. That's a wound, and it's mine, and I'll carry it. And then I said, what I'm telling you calmly is that you called me freight at my own table, in front of our pastor and my brother. And then you went to bed that same night knowing a law firm believed I'd already agreed to be sold out of my own company. I said, you can have the divorce. You cannot have the shop. Dermot tried to talk. He reached for that smooth board meeting voice he's used on me for 12 years, and there was nothing in that room left for it to land on. And Simone stood up, picked up her purse, and walked out my front door without 1 word to her husband. I watched something in that man's face go completely out when he understood that his own wife wasn't going to sit there and help him. Then I turned to my son. Beck hadn't said anything the entire time. He'd been looking at the table. I said, Beckett, 6 weeks ago I asked you a question, and you gave me an objection instead of an answer. I'm going to give you 1 more chance at it, and I'm going to do it here, so you only have to do it once. And my son sat there for what felt like a very long time. And then, in a voice I hadn't heard out of him since he was maybe 15, cracking right down the middle, he said, 85,000, after the close, for not making noise. Nobody said anything. He said, I didn't take it. I want you to know I never took $1 of it. And I said, did you say no? And my son said, no. And there it was. I felt something in my chest go very still. Not hot, still. And I said, Beck, it wasn't just business. It was 30 years of my life, and you knew that, and $85,000 was your price to watch it happen. And then my wife spoke, and she said the thing that has cost me more sleep than anything else in this entire story. She said, do you want to know why I could hear the number and not flinch, Milo? And I said yes, and I meant it. She said, because I've never owned any of it either. She said, my name is on that paperwork. It has been on it since 1996. I did the books until 2008. I found the Warren Avenue building. I walked into a purchasing office at a hotel in Freeport in 1999 with a sample under my arm and got you your first commercial contract. And then she said, And I have listened to you tell the founding story of that company at, 40 dinners? A magazine did a profile on you in 2016. I have read every version of it, and I am not in a single one. She said, "It's always a man in a garage." And then, quieter, 35%, and I have never decided one thing. The room was completely silent, and I want to tell you what I did with that, because it's the whole reason this story is worth 20 minutes of your evening. I didn't argue with her, because she was right. Every word of it was true. She found that building. She got that Freeport contract. She wore a blazer she bought at Marshall's, and she walked in cold and she came out with a purchase order, and I have told that story exactly 0 times in 26 years. I sat at that table, and I understood, about 40 minutes too late, that I had given my wife a third of a company and never once given her a vote. And I had given my son a title I invented, with no actual job under it, because it was easier than either training him properly or telling him the truth. And here's what I finally understood, and it's the thing I'd want you to take with you. A title is not a seat. I handed out ownership and job titles like they were gifts, and I never handed out the one thing that actually costs you something, which is, say, the right to decide a thing and have it stand. And people who hold a title with no voice will eventually go get a voice somewhere else, from a private equity firm in Boston, from a CFO who asks their opinion at a shop party and then actually does what they said. That's how a reasonable woman ends up in an unreasonable place. Now, and I need to be just as clear about this part, none of that puts a hand on what she did. Her grievance was real. Her grievance did not require an affair. It did not require $114,000 siphoned through a mailbox on Forest Avenue that she had signature authority to notice and chose not to. It did not require the word freight in front of my brother. She had 100 doors. She could have sat across from me at any point in 30 years and said the sentence she said at that table in December, and I'd like to believe I'd have heard it. But she said it for the first time with an attorney in the room and a district attorney referral on the table. 2 things can be true. She was owed something. She took something else entirely. Dermot Keene was charged with theft and insurance fraud, and he was gone from my company that same week. Names stripped off every account, every vendor file, every piece of paper he ever signed. Norwood Bridge walked the moment their counsel heard the word investigation, which suited me fine, because I never wanted to sell that shop. Not for 2.6, not for 4.8, not for any number a stranger from Boston can put on a page. Roz and I finalized in the spring. I'll be honest about the settlement because people always want to know. With documented fraud and infidelity in the file, Whit negotiated a number considerably below what she'd been counting on in March. She kept the house. I didn't want it. Too many rooms and one particular table. I kept the shop. Tova Lindgren holds a real 18% now, and a title that finally matches what she's actually been doing since 2008. Beck isn't in the business. I told him gently, and I did try to be gentle, that I need people around me I don't have to wonder about. He's selling commercial insurance in Nashua now. We talk about, once a month, carefully, the way 2 people talk when trust has to get rebuilt in small, honest pieces instead of just assumed. I haven't given up on my son. I want to say that. He's 34. He's got time. And Noel. 2 weeks after that Sunday, I sat down with Whit and rebuilt my whole estate. There's an irrevocable trust in my daughter's name now, funded from the settlement, holding a 10% stake in the company separate from operations, so that no matter what happens to me, she has something real that nobody can quietly move around while she isn't looking. And I paid off her student loans, $11,000 and change, quietly in one payment on a Tuesday. I did it because, when I asked her back in October if she'd known anything, the only thing she said was that she wasn't going anywhere. I wanted to answer that the way it deserved to be answered. So here's the one thing I'd ask you to actually do this week, and it's smaller than you think and harder than it sounds. Pick one person you've given a role to. At work, at home, doesn't matter. Somebody whose name is on something of yours. Ask them one question about it that you don't already know the answer to, and then do what they say. Not a suggestion box. Not let me think about it. Actually hand over one decision and let it stand, even if you'd have done it differently. Because I gave my wife a third of a company for 29 years and never gave her one afternoon of that, and it cost me a marriage, a CFO, and very nearly the only thing I've ever built. And here's the question I'd like you sitting with tonight when the house goes quiet. Who in your life has their name on something of yours? and has never once been allowed to decide anything about it. I'm at the shop most mornings now, slower. My left hand's still 80%, and that's what it's going to be. And there's a peace in that building I hadn't felt in years, because every single person standing in it wants to be standing in it. Last month we did the steeple on a church out in Yarmouth, same town where Roz and I got married, which I didn't think about until I was already on the road. And Tova put me up on the staging. I hadn't been up in 14 months. She rigged it herself, checked every plank twice, and went up right behind me, and she stood on that platform with one hand flat on the back of my belt the entire hour I was up there. Never mentioned it. Not once going up, not once coming down. I got to lay in 11 feet of ridge cap with my own hands, 60 feet over Yarmouth, with the bay out to the east, and a woman who has no legal obligation to me whatsoever held onto my belt so I could do it. That's the whole thing right there. That's what I've got after all of it. So before you go, I want to hear from you, and I mean it. Comment a 1 if you think I was right to take it apart quietly, the referral, the freeze, the folder on the table, instead of blowing it up the second I knew. Comment a 2 if you think I should have stood up at that dinner table in October and said something right then, in front of the pastor and my brother, and let the chips land. And comment a 3 if you think the part I actually got wrong was 30 years of we that always meant me, and that my wife's last speech at that table had more truth in it than I want to admit. Number 3 is the one I want to hear about, honestly, because that's the one I'm still turning over at 4 in the morning. And tell me where you're watching from tonight, and what that clock says where you are. Somebody's got this playing in a truck in a parking lot with the engine running. I've been that man. I'd like to know you're out there. Most of all, tell me if you've lived a version of this. If somebody has ever said the true, ugly thing about you in a room full of people and you laughed so nobody would be uncomfortable. That's not weakness. That's a habit you were taught. But habits are what other people build their plans around. That's the part I'd want you to hear, and it took me 68 years and one phone call at 10:52 at night to learn it. If this one got to you, subscribe before you go. That's the one thing that actually keeps this going. I put a new story up every week, and the next one's already written, and I think it'll sit on you the way this one still sits on me. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of it. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Portland, Maine to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.